Hey folks, hey y'all, I have this Bible here, I have this cup of coffee here. I want to mix the two together for another coffee break with the Bible. And the passage in front of us today is the very ubiquitous Matthew chapter 7, which, of course, right here, you see it on the screen, says, "Judge not." Judge not. And that'll do it for today's Bible study, everybody. Thank you. Hope you can tune in to the next video I make that is a Bible study coffee break. Nothing more to see here. The Bible says don't judge. Just kidding. Of course, you know that's not truly what's going on here in these words. But you also know that's the way a lot of people take these words, or twist these words, maybe better put. They try to use them to discourage all forms of judgment, period, end of discussion. No quote-unquote judgment. And you know, I don't want to blow anyone's mind here, but it requires a judgment to judge that something is a judgment. You know what I mean? In order for you to say, hey, you're judging me, you first have to make a judgment, not to get not to get too much in the weeds with that. But yeah, I mean, the Lord here is telling us a certain kind of judgment is not to be made, but He's certainly not telling us that all forms of judgment are condemned. Why, that would make Matthew chapter 7 a very awkward chapter if all forms of judgment are condemned, because Jesus will and look, here we go, judge not. Right here, Jesus says that is hypocritical. So Jesus has just made a judgment. Dum dum dum. Here he says, do not judge, allegedly. Don't judge at all. Of course, we know that's not what he's saying, but we'll go with the popular view for a second here, just to kind of see how silly it is. If Jesus says don't judge at all, what's Jesus doing right here in verse 5? Judging. Now, he's judging this particular interesting case, a silly case, I say with all due respect, silly case of a man who has a speck in his eye. And coming to this man's rescue, who has a little speck in his eye, is his brother. But here's the deal. His brother has a log in his own eye. So Mr. Log Eye says to Mr. Speck Eye, let me help you out with that. You got something wrong with your eye, brother. Meanwhile, he's got a log hanging out of his own eye. Jesus says that is hypocritical, which is indeed the case. But this is, you guessed it, this is a judgment. And it's not the only judgment that Jesus is going to make here in this chapter and tell us we need to make here in this chapter. Look at this one, verse number 6. Jesus, famous quote of Jesus here, says, do not give dogs that which is holy. Wait just a minute. Come back to that. And do not throw your pearls before pigs. Hold up. Right here, if we're going to keep this command that Jesus is giving, we're going to have to be able to judge what is holy and what's a pearl. And we're also going to have to judge what's a dog and what's a pig. We're going to have to make some judgments if we're going to keep these extremely famous words of Christ here, as we must keep these words of Christ. Jesus goes on to talk about a straight and a narrow gate. Famously, Matthew chapter 7 is where we are. And if you just kind of mosey down to verse 13, you have the very famous words of entering in at the straight and narrow gate. There's a wide road. There's a narrow gate. We have to be able to figure out which is which. What's that? Well, I'll tell you what it is in a word. It's judgment. We have to look at a way and say, nope, that's not the way for me to go. We have to look at a way and say, oh yeah, that's the one Jesus wants me to do. And then, verse 15 here, Jesus famously says, beware of false prophets who come in sheep's clothing. Inwardly, they're ravenous wolves. Whoa, wait a minute. I mean, the amount of judging that we have to do just to keep up with what Jesus is telling us here, it's getting up there. We're having to do a lot of judging just to keep and honor these words of Christ. We have to determine who is a false prophet and how this false prophet might attempt to infiltrate a flock of believers. We have to be slightly discerning of the inner motives as they're being revealed to us. Now, we're not judging blindly, blanketly, based on what we want to be true or think might happen. That's the kind of empty judgment Jesus tells us to stay away from. And in fact, a fuller reading here of the earlier verses of Matthew chapter 7, he says, verse 2, Matthew 7:2, with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. With the measure you use, it will be measured to you. That's a newer translation, English Standard Version, that is. But still, maybe it's a little less difficult in the New American Standard Bible, where Matthew 7:2 says, in the way that you judge, you will be judged. With what judgment you judge, you shall be judged, is another very popular reading, one of my favorites. So Jesus, far from condemning all forms of judgment, come on. Do you think the Bible would be this thick if all forms of judgment was condemned? Far from condemning all forms of judgment, Jesus is telling us that our judgment needs to be factual, our judgment needs to be righteous, our judgment needs to be informed, our judgment needs to be wise, not shallow, not based on hearsay, not made up. Because the way that we judge, we are going to be judged. Notice Jesus didn't say, for the way that you judge, wait a minute, you don't have any business judging anybody anyway. You know, if we didn't have any business judging anybody anyway, why didn't Jesus say that here in verse number 2? No, instead of saying that, he says, with the judgment that you judge or you pronounce, you will be judged. So Jesus says, you're going to go around making judgments, and the way that you make these judgments is the way that you're going to be judged yourself, so be careful. Notice Jesus did not say, only God can judge people, so don't you run around making any judgments at all, making anybody feel bad, saying things that might slightly upset somebody. No. You leave that to me. Jesus didn't say that. In fact, Jesus made some very challenging statements here that require us to become very good at this skill of making righteous judgments. Jesus, in a very famous passage, Matthew chapter 7, we are at, of course, he talks about trees and their fruits. And he says that good trees don't bring forth bad fruit, bad trees don't bring forth good fruit. So the earlier cited fruit inspecting line kind of has come to be from our understanding of these verses. Jesus is saying, by their fruits you'll recognize them. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. You'll know them by their fruits. So that's what we do as Christians. We look at the fruits. and we take Jesus' words to heart, that good fruit comes from good lives, bad fruit, sadly, comes from bad lives. That's the way it works. It doesn't work any other way. And so we know how somebody's life is with God based on what they show us. We don't know everything. There are things surely that people keep secret, and things that only God knows about somebody, yeah, but Jesus isn't talking about those things. He's talking about the publicly produced fruits. And by these fruits, we will be able to make good and wise judgments that will help not only us as Christians, not only our families, but will also help the people we're talking about, the people we are examining, if you'll allow that phrase. Because we can look at someone's life and say, you know what? This isn't it. This is not it. If you want to please God, you got to stop doing this, and this. And you've got to start doing this, and this. That's the way we make Christians. That's the way we keep Christians faithful. That's the way we grow in our own faith, is by looking at our life honestly, just like the prodigal son did. Love thinking about him along these lines. He went off into a bad, riotous life. And what does the Bible say about him? The Bible very famously says that he came to himself. He shot up, he woke up, he made a judgment about himself. How about that? And he determined that he needed to live a better life. And it was good for him. Very, very good for him. And that's the way that you can grow your faith. That's the way that you can grow your family's faith. That's the way that you can convert your unsaved family member or coworker or neighbor or whoever it is in your life who's not living a right life with God. We're not bombastic about our place with God. We know that if we are saved by a wonderful blend of God's love and God's grace, and yes, our obedience to that, our faithfulness to that. But if we're saved, we know we're not saved because we're so much better than everybody else. We know that we're saved because of God's plan. And it's not just a plan for you and me, it's a plan for everybody. If we will break this crazy cycle that says we can't make any judgment at all, don't you dare say anything about anybody that might turn them off or make them mad or make them upset. Notice that Jesus here is making some pretty extreme statements. You hypocrite. Have you ever called somebody a hypocrite? Maybe you have. Perhaps you have. Jesus here is making this proclamation very, very boldly. You hypocrite. And have you ever called somebody a dog or a pig? Maybe. I don't know. But especially in this spiritual setting here in which it's placed, I don't know that that's something that flies out of our mouth as quickly as it does Jesus' mouth here. And I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, we need to talk more like Jesus, so maybe we need to step up our game in what he's telling us to do here. Step up our allegiance, maybe I should say, to be a bit more precise with that terminology. Step up our allegiance to what Jesus is saying here. Have you ever looked at a way and said, no, that's not the way the Lord wants me to go? That's a way that leads to destruction. Have you ever looked at a path and said, yeah, that's the straight and narrow way? Well, I hope you've done those things as a Christian. Have you ever been weary of false prophets? Have you ever looked at a false prophet and said, man, nuh-uh? I hope so. That's what Jesus tells you to do here. And that is a very proper application of what Jesus teaches us about judging. I love y'all very much. I'm taking a coffee break with this passage here because it is so misunderstood.